So basically, the outline for this panel is that I'll give the floor to each research team for like approximately 10 minutes. And they'll present basically their papers, their premises, the assumptions they used and tested, how they went about the research methods, what they observed, and some key findings. Now, for the audience, the speakers already know that, but for the audience, please use this opportunity to take the floor at any point. I will be looking at the screen, taking notes as moderator, but also looking who raises their virtual flag. And for all the speakers, please assist me if you see that there is a hand raised up. Just let's flag it to me, maybe using the chat function at some appropriate moment. When there is a pause between two presentations, I'll find a moment, I will give the floor to the audience. After the research teams finish their presentation, we'll have follow-up questions. Now, I have follow-up questions myself, not only because I read the papers, but I had some little advantage compared to you. I have the slides that will be presented. But again, turning to the audience, I urge you, this is a unique opportunity that we have all the researchers online. It's not easy to get them all. Use this opportunity. It's very engaging when you ask questions. I think it's good for our speakers as well. For the presentations themselves, the slides that the researchers will use will become available on the site, on the webpage of the event. So don't worry about taking notes. I have worried about that. You can just raise the hand at any point and I'll give you the floor. Right, so unless I see questions on process, and I don't, I have given now the time to this breakout session to become even bigger. We have 50 participants. Let me then start with our first research paper. Let me give the floor to the team that wrote the paper on gender and collusion. Let me welcome Professor Justus Haucap. He's a director at the Düsseldorf Institute of Competition Economics, together with Christina Heldman, who is a PhD candidate also at the same institute, at the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics, and Holger. He's an assistant professor at the University of Göttingen. They will let me know that they will take the floor consecutively to present their slides. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Despina. It's a great honor and pleasure actually to open this breakout session today with our paper. And let me just very briefly make a few remarks before Christina will take over with what we actually did. And tell you a little bit about the motivation of our paper. At the Institute, of course, we think about competition policy and economics for quite a while, but most of the literature, actually, especially in economics, that you find about cartels and collusive behavior is about the market and the firms that are involved in collusion, but it's not so much about the people who are actually involved in collusion. And at the very end, it is often individuals that engage in cartels or collusive behavior, sometimes even without the knowledge of the board. So we thought we should actually focus more on who is actually colluding, what kind of people are these people who collude. And we thought, we don't really know a lot about this. Not a lot is published about the people who collude. So we thought it may be more interesting to research this in more detail. And in particular, we thought we know from the literature on trust, from sociology, but also from psychology, economics, that trust between people also depends on their characteristics, their personal traits, their socio-demographic characteristics, and so on. And we obviously one difference between people is their gender. So we thought maybe it's interesting to look at the gender. Are actually females as likely to engage in collusive behavior as males, given that we also often talk about the old boys network and so on, that already somewhat gives it away that it seems to be somewhat more male dominant, the cartel scene. So we thought, well, let's have a look at it. And we took, in contrast to the others, an experimental approach. We will talk about this in a few seconds, because we thought it's particularly good to control actually for quite a number of variables. And so we set up a cartel experiment and said, well, let's look at the issue: how likely are people to cooperate? How is there a difference between male and female participants in the nature to collude? And what's different from, let's say, traditional trust and cooperation games is that cartels are cooperation that harms third parties, typically. So it's not a good cooperation. It's a type of cooperation that we typically want to prohibit. So we thought, well, there's not a lot of literature either on cooperation if third parties are harmed. So we said, okay, let's combine this and let's look at, how likely is there a difference between men and women in their willingness to collude, and how is this willingness to collude affected if we impose what we call as economists a negative externality? So we could say if we inflict a harm on a third party, in our consumers, so to say. And what we did exactly, something that Christina will tell you now.
Yeah. So yeah, just like Justus already said, we decided to conduct a laboratory experiment. We decided to do this because it allows us to have a balanced panel, so to get like close to equally men and women in our panel, which is not always the case if you look at field data. And it also allows us to like turn off and on factors that might influence behaviors, such as information, the level of information. And by that, we can really isolate the preferences of men and women in this laboratory experiment. This experiment was conducted online with students from the University of Düsseldorf. And these students were presented with a situation where they could collude at the costs of a passive outsider, which can be translated into a consumer in real life. And let me quickly go through the setup so that you get a better idea of what we did. Before the main experiment started, all the participants were asked to fill out a basic questionnaire, which contained gender, age, duration of study. This information was used later in the experiment. After everybody was done, all the participants were matched into groups of 3, and within these groups, 3 roles were allocated, roles A, B, and C. With A and B being the active players, the players who were later confronted with the opportunity to collude, and C being this passive outsider, the consumer. People were informed about which role they had, and then they moved to the main part of the experiment, the cooperation problem. This cooperation problem consisted of 2 stages, which were basically identical and only differed in the amount of information the participants had on each other. In the first stage, people did not know anything about the other players. They were completely anonymous. And players A and B were confronted with a prisoner's dilemma-like situation where they had to decide whether to set a high price or a low price without knowing what the other player did. And player C did not participate in this game, but depending on the treatment, he or she was affected by the choices of A and B. So we introduced 2 treatments, which means that part of the participants played one treatment and the rest was played the other treatment. And the first treatment is the baseline treatment, where we do not have any externality. There's no harm for the outsider. So whatever A and B do, player C's payoff is always the same. And the negative treatment, the second treatment, here the outsider's payoff is reduced by half if the active players decide to collude. So if both players set a high price, player C is harmed, there is a negative externality, and his or her payoff is reduced. And having these 2 treatments allowed us to really identify how the presence of this externality influences behavior, cooperation behavior. So while players A and B were playing this game, player C was again passive. He had to guess the outcome and got an extra euro if he or she was right. After players A and B had decided on a high or low price, they were rematched. So again, 3 people were put into a group, but everybody kept their role. And now players A and B got information about the other player, the person they interacted with. They got to know the gender, the age, and the duration of study, which we asked in the beginning. And then everybody moved to the second stage, which was completely identical to the first one that I just explained, with only the difference being that A and B now knew these three personal characteristics about the other player. And by distinguishing these two stages, we were later able to identify how information affects behavior, trusting behavior or collusive behavior. Yeah, so here again, players A and B made their choice, players C guessed, and afterwards every participant moved into the second stage on the second part of the experiment. And here we used some small games, some questionnaires to elicit economic preferences and psychological measures that the previous literature has identified as relevant for trusting and cooperating behavior, because in the next step, we really wanted to find out what drives the choices that our participants made. So yeah, our sessions were conducted in spring, and we already have the results, which Holger will now present.
Okay, let me start with the results. So this is an overview of what Christina basically just introduced. So please focus on the left-hand side. So this is the aggregate data of our treatments. What you can see is the pink bar, which actually represents the baseline data. And what quite clearly can be seen is that more people are collusive in the baseline treatment. That is 52% of people form cartels in the situation. And this case drops significantly when we move to the treatment with the negative externality. So what we can see here is that it really matters that we impose this negative externality on third parties, which are our consumers. So let me go ahead with the next diagram. Exactly, this is an overview of the gender results. This is the most important finding here. First of all, we just focus on the baseline bars. As you can see, there are no gender differences. So the green and the orange bars are quite the same. It's around 50%. 52% of women are cooperative in the baseline treatment when they don't impose any externality. And it's the same thing for men. It's exactly 51% of men are collusive in the baseline treatment. And interestingly, the women are significantly less collusively in the negative externality treatment. Yeah, you see this on the left-hand side when you focus on the green bars. And for men, we hardly observe any difference. So it's really the women who drive the difference on the left-hand side for the blue bar. And finally, we will briefly look at the second stage results. Exactly, this is the stage where we focus on the effect of information. What you can see here is basically on the very right hand side, for women nothing really happens. Yeah? So it doesn't matter for women if the information of gender is revealed to the other party, and if they know what the gender of the other party is, it doesn't really matter. Yeah? So we have 34% of women who are collusive in the negative treatment, and 32% of women who are collusive in the negative treatment without information. But interestingly, for men, it makes a big difference. Yeah? So if you recall that, so men were quite collusively in the first stage of the negative externality treatment. So this is the 46% you find in the middle, the orange bar. And it's exactly what you find in our last diagram is that men are becoming less collusively in the case when we reveal the information, which is quite interesting. It's quite remarkable. As soon as you reveal the information of interaction partners, men really trust less. So maybe you go ahead with the bullet points. Yeah. So what we can summarize here is that women collude less when the outside is harmed. This is of course seen in the middle. So this a closer look shows that this effect was driven by women who are guilt and shame averse. So we also elicited this data on the psychological measures. And you don't see this in this diagram, but our analysis revealed that it was exactly the women who are guilt and shame averse who really caused this drop you see in the middle graph of our diagram. And interestingly, men collude less when interacting with other men. And this effect was driven by men who are betrayal averse. So actually, the explanation for our final finding that as soon as you reveal the gender information, that men drop their collusive rates. So the reason for that was that men were betrayal averse. So actually, they feel betrayed if other men rip them off. So maybe you go ahead with the last slide. of the results. These are the recommendations for competition agencies. Yeah, so what we suppose is that increased female representation in management positions can make collusion less likely. So actually, the implication would be to promote diversity as part of competition advocacy work and the evaluation of firms' compliance programs. So what's also quite interesting would be to develop gender-sensitive forensic cartel analysis, because our results really show it matters who actually acts. Yeah. So this was something what Justus said in the beginning. We were very much interested for the heterogeneity of the players, and actually it matters that men or women are acting. And what's also important is that enforcement priorities may be given to industries which are characterized by low degrees of management diversity. Yeah? So if you realize there might be a low degree of management diversity, maybe it may pay off to increase basically the share of women. Yeah? And what's also very important is, of course, to collect and to report more data on the socio-demographic characteristics of cartel participants, which may facilitate future research. So I give the floor to Justus, and then he will continue with our final remarks.
Actually, we still have plans for future work. Yeah, which I will quickly summarize. So yeah, our study is of course just like a first peek into what can be a very large research agenda, and there's so much to yeah, analyze. But I think in general, you could say that future research should definitely dig deeper into how men and women create and stabilize trust, which is in turn the foundation of collusion. So for example, previous research has shown that communication can really facilitate the creation of trust. People get closer to each other, they can signal their intended behavior. And here it would be very interesting to see how men and women communicate in such situation, in collusive situations, and how it affects the outcomes. And the same goes for repeated interaction, which can also really increase and stabilize trust in collusion. And especially when we look back to these results where men collude less when interacting with other men, it would be interesting to know if and how it changes if the social distance becomes even smaller as they communicate or interact repeatedly. And here again might be a difference between men and women, how they react to different levels of yeah, social distance. And I think this would be very interesting to look into further. Another relevant topic would be the introduction of antitrust policies such as leniency programs. We know from research that women are more risk averse than men, and they might collude less when they face the risk of being penalized. So to our knowledge, there's very little research on that distinguishes between men and women and how they react to this risk in cartels. So yeah, this would be also very interesting to look into more closely. And lastly, a more general remark, the analysis should not only or does not only have to focus on gender, but could also expand to other individual characteristics such as cultural, educational differences. Yeah, the work becomes more connected, firms will become more diverse inevitably. And yeah, we think that there's definitely much room for research, not only on gender, but on yeah, all kinds of individual characteristics. And yeah, we will definitely take part in this future research. And yeah, but for now, this is it. And thank you very much for your attention. And we're looking forward to interesting questions and a nice discussion later.
I see a hand up, Jona.
Yes, hi. So I just wanted just a technicality. When you say collude in the setup of this experiment, does that mean willingness to collude? There's when an individual says she is willing to collude, that registers, or it has to be both parties interested in collusion, then we have collusion, and then that registers. Otherwise no collusion is. So I'm trying to understand what qualified as collusion. Is it the willingness, or is it only if it would actually materialize?
So actually the way how we modeled it was that everybody has to collude, so both players. And so actually they don't talk. So it's just they choose strategies in the experiment. And we only count collusion when both parties collude. So like a cartel. If only one person colluded, then we didn't count it here.
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting research. Really, really fascinating. I just had a comment on your future research agenda. I did a couple of years ago a survey in Chile on people's attitudes towards cartels, collusion, and the sanctions applicable to those. And I found, I mean, it's not exactly what you're looking at, because I assume that you'll probably do a lab experiments creating leniency conditions, etc. But what I found was that women were less likely to express their agreement when an authority decides to give leniency, like when they decide to exempt a company from fines. More women tended to react negatively. They would disagree or very strongly disagree than men. So they, in general, have, I guess, a bit more concern about the fairness or the justice aspect of leniency as sort of outsiders, as third parties. And I also found that they were less positive about the possibility of criminal sanctions for cartel participants. So they were more likely to, for instance, be in favor of, I don't know, disqualification from public offices, company directorships, etc. So at least women as you know, third parties or citizens are not that positive about some of these measures that competition authorities or legislators might introduce, like leniency or criminal sanctions against cartel participants. Just a small comment about that. Thank you. Very interesting.
That's very interesting. Actually, if you could, we would be quite grateful if you could send us a link or something to that paper, because I think that can inspire our future work for, as you rightly say, the experiments that we want to set up in the future. And this will be, I think, great inspiration to know what to look for, basically.
Yeah, sure, will do.
Thanks, and thank you, Justus. Valentino, I see Valentino Mutzea, who has his hands up.
Yeah, thank you, Despina. Very interesting study. In my knowledge, at least, it's a first. It's making strides in a, let's say, at least little explored area. So that's why that comes my question. I would say that, let's say, more women in management, in the boards of the companies, is a rather new phenomenon and still lagging behind in so many places. So I wonder if these conclusions that women are less prone to collude, is this done perhaps because they are, let's say, recent in the business, let's say, don't have the old habits that men had the time to have, or it's something which could be specific to some psychology, because let's say mostly say women are more organized, let's say, tend to be more fair in everything they do. So which means, is it something, I mean, in your opinion of the authors of the study, is something which could be transitory, like when we have more women in the boards, they might take the same habits, and then collusion could be more or less the same across the board, so men and women, or is something which really could change collusion, how collusion is made, so will have an impact in the good sense in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually, I think. And we don't know the answer yet. We thought about it as well, but our hope is that we can find a little bit more out about it if we rerun this experiment or similar experiments with people from the real business world, let's say. And there we are currently in contact to see sort of, and then maybe also get some idea about, so if we can sort of the demographic characteristics of these people, how long have they been in the particular business, and so on. And then we may not have the final answer, but we may have a better idea sort of on whether it's people who are relatively new, let's say, to a situation, or already long time in that particular situation. So that's definitely a very interesting question for our future research. And at this point, I can say maybe this entire project is for us is almost like a seed funding or something, so incubation. So we have developed a lot of plans now for what to do next.
If you let me one more, thank you, Professor. One more word. So that's the point. So in the end, it's not just about a study, because it's about a hope. Because, and I think my feeling is that women in general, they will tend to be more compliant, so respect the rules, be fair in everything they do. So that's why I think it's one reason to support women being more present in the business, even in the politics, I would say. So let's say overall.
Yep.
So I think it's a hope, and you should, so it's excellent that you raise this flag, and you should keep the pace and show that this hope materializes in let's say better compliance environment. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Unless I'm mistaken, do I see another hand? I don't think I see one. Please interrupt me if no. Then let me proceed with the next research presentation. And just let me remind you, if you have any questions, including for the presentation we just heard from our colleagues in Düsseldorf and Göttingen, feel free to raise your hand at the end of the next presentation, or the presentation after that, or even at the end of all presentations. Just those of you that thought they might have had the question but didn't have time to ask it. So let's move to the next team. As I have very briefly announced, it is the team that has written the paper called Gender Bias in Cartel Engagement. This has been led by Joan-Ramon Borrell from the University of Barcelona, José Manuel Ordóñez from the University of Malaga, and Carmen, García, and Juan-Luis Jiménez from the University of Las Palmas in Gran Canaria. The team has let me know that Joan-Ramon will be the person from the team that has been designated to present the results of this collective work. So Joan-Ramon, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Despina. Thank you very much, all the OECD team organizing all this call, all these workshops, and all this project with the help of many people and the Canadian Authority, principally. Okay, so let me try to. Okay, you can see the presentation, right? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so let me see. Carmen, Juan-Luis, and José Manuel, they are all here. They asked me at the little bit at the last minute that I carry on these 10 minutes, so I'll try my best. It's been a very interesting project. A bit challenging due to the time constraints, but let's see. I think we have managed to gather quite a lot of data. I think that was one of the purposes and the ideas of all this project, to gather data and start working with more concrete evidence. And we have been working on cartel engagement and cartels for the last years. So we've tried to get the best of it and introduce gender bias and gender in our research. Okay, so the motivation was that, right? So as we have been working on cartels and we had quite a lot of data and evidence, we introduced this idea that we are finding in the literature that the board members, the composition in general from Berbers may have an impact on cartel activity, engagement, and the continuation of cartels. There's literature on that. However, there's very few literature trying to single out the gender dimension, right? So that's our topic. The research question was that, okay, let's introduce gender bias and whether the gender of the board members have any importance on cartel activities. The idea at the very beginning, so we have been changing a little bit as the evidence is showing otherwise. We wanted to know whether firms change course, whether firms start participating in cartels whenever they have more or less women on the boards, and whether the other way around, maybe some the cartels discontinue. We have all the leniency programs in many countries. There's been a really successful policy, leniency to discover cartels, and whether maybe the presence of women may affect the likelihood of engaging in these leniency programs and stopping the cartel activity, right? If this is so, this dimension should have should be taken into account when designing the policy enforcement of anti-cartel laws, right? At the same time, we knew that we had a driver of the change that was very pushing, and it has been pushing ahead on trying to balancing the gender in boards. Is about that some countries at the same time they were like discovering more and more cartels due to the leniency policies. At the same time, they were introducing quotas of women in boards, right? That was an exogenous driver that it was very interesting. So we wanted to know to what extent we may see something going on because of these changes in the boards. Okay, it's not a natural. Okay, it's not a human experiment in the sense that we can control everything. No, it's more like something going on, natural experiment. We have to check whether we have a good control and treatment group, whether the countries and the firms that are affected by these quotas may change their cartel activity due to the presence of more women, right? So those were interesting research questions, and we thought that we could contribute putting up some evidence and some methods to try to analyze these data. In the last presentation, we already were working on the European cartel cases. We are very grateful to John Connor. He provided us the last minute of his huge database. We all know about cartels around the world, and from this data set, we managed to get 52 cartelized firms that have been discovered that they have been participating in cartels within the last 10 years. And then we were looking for 50 comparable firms. So we end up with these 50 matched comparable firms that are non-cartelized. Okay, so we end up with some data on cartelized and non-cartelized firms, and then we were looking for the gender composition of boards, and those cartels are a little bit short. It's 2-year cartels because of the time constraints. It was very difficult to get more information on these firms and the gender composition before 2010. It was very difficult, so we managed to do it for 10 years. And okay, it's a nice data set with some cartelized and non-cartelized firms. On the other hand, that's new. That's a part that we didn't present last time. We have been looking for the cartel cases in Spain. We have a little bit more information up to 20 years. And in this case, we identify 182 cartelized firms, and then we look also for similar non-cartelized firms, similar in different dimensions. And we managed to get that. We had the information from one firm that was doing web scraping from all the information about corporate boards in Spain, and it was a little bit messy and a big data project at the very end because it was a lot of information. And in this case, we don't know exactly the board member composition, but at least we had all the information about the appointments and terminations of board members. Okay, so we didn't manage to get the stock, okay, really the percentage of women in every moment of time, but at least we know whether the appointments and terminations were women or men throughout time. The good thing is that, okay, cartels a bit longer in this second database, 4 and 7 years, so almost 5 years. These firms were engaging in cartels, and okay, we may do the same exercise. Okay, so let me show you a little bit what was the idea, the methods, what we wanted to try with this database. And Okay, maybe I should spoil a little bit myself and tell you where we are heading towards. Okay, so the very end, the database that is working is the European one, not so successful in the Spanish one. Okay, so let me tell you at the very beginning. And secondly, okay, we managed to get an interesting result of how boards change after some firm is really sanctioned and discovered that it has engaged in the cartel, but not so much the other way around. That it was our interest at the very beginning. To what extent it is more likely that some firm engage in cartel behavior if the board is more an old men club. Okay, so we didn't manage to. Okay, we first, with this logic model, we tried to figure out that, right? What's the likelihood of cartel cartel formation or cartel breakup? We tried both, depending on the percentage of women on boards or the number of appointments and terminations of women on boards. Okay, so we did that with a logic model with a lot of controls. It's a little bit like an experiment in the sense that, okay, the women on boards come in different countries depending on these binding gender policies, binding quotas, right? So that's nice because we have like an external driver there that is making some difference. However, okay, not all the countries have quotas. So what we think is that we have no a lot of movement on this right-hand side variable. So we are not saying that there is no impact. We didn't find it. Okay, we didn't find it. With a slightly different estimator, a diff in diff estimator, this is taking into account how things changes across time in different specifications. We tried the other way around. Okay, it's a little bit the other way around, and we tried to identify the effect as we were not obtaining the identification of the effect with the logic. With the second, it was okay. Maybe we have the other way around, and we found literature that was telling us that after a firm is sanctioned, boards are restructured. And okay, the nice result is that we really found that, and we really found that this restructuring is making the firms that have been sanctioned due to cartel to be more balanced, gender balanced, and not for the other firms. That's interesting. So just across time, it's not something that's happening for all the firms. Not only for the firms that have been sanctioned, we find this cartel after cartel restructuring, after the firm has been sanctioned due to the cartel, then they change and they become more gender balanced. It's like the firms try to signal the market that they have changed and that is not an old club man in the board. That's an interesting result. So let me show you that this is mostly the findings, but let me show you the detail and some things that are important. The important thing is that if we look, this is the European database. If we look at the presence of women in boards, look that there is no difference between the cartelized and non-cartelized firms. So we don't find any difference. That's important. So there is no mean difference on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we see the trends. So there is an increasing trend. So that our paper also, I think, is one paper that is showing evidence on this increasing trend in the percentage of women on board. Although this is a little bit selected data, right? Because this is selected for cartel firms and some mirror firms that is similar, but that are non-cartelized. So this is not like representative of all the firms, right? But with respect to the cartelized and similar non-cartelized, we can see this trend, although it's common. It's a common trend. There is no difference. So when we look at this relationship of how firms restructure the composition of the board, we can see very clear that it is in the countries that have binding policies, binding quotas, we see that really the presence of women on the left-hand side increases significantly. These arrows try to measure the standard deviations, or the ones that on the upper part, after the end of the period, we show clearly that there is an effect. So there's an increasing of the number of women in the corporate boards of these firms that have been sanctioned due to the antitrust policy, anti-cartel policy. This is not happening in the countries where there is non-binding policies. So this is an interesting interaction in which it looks like this effect of cartel restructuring can introduce this gender balance when there is binding policies. If not, it seems that this is not working. So there is here an interaction that is very interesting. Okay, with respect to the Spanish data, okay, a little bit disappointing. We were, I can tell you, because we found no this effect in Spain. The problem, we can explain that because Spain has no binding quotas. Okay, so this is consistent with the previous result. Spain is one of the countries that have no binding quotas, and this effect is not there. So corporate boards may be restructured after the cartel is sanctioned, but the firm is not balancing the gender of the board just after the cartel, probably because they are not obliged to do that. And then our lesson from here is that then this all-men club effect remains there. There is no break on that. Okay. So mostly this is it. So the key findings are really that we don't find we have this influence that we were expecting, that balancing the boards it might be a mechanism to really avoid cartel formation or to promote cartel breakup. But we are not sure is that the evidence is not showing that. Maybe the causal effect is there, but maybe there is not enough variation on the percentage of women in boards to see this effect. So we don't find it. What we really found is this cartel busting that leads to corporate board restructuring, and this restructuring is going to be gender balanced whenever there is these quotas, these binding quotas. Okay, so it seems really this we also contribute then to this literature that really the corporate board seems to be clearly restructuring. So if the firms were not restructuring, we shouldn't see this effect of the binding policy. So we are contributing to this literature that is telling that the antitrust authorities, whenever they prosecute cartels and sanction cartels, they are having an effect on the board composition. Okay, and in the countries where there is these binding quotas, then we see that more women enter into the board. That's interesting. So I think that is very related to the previous paper and the following, in the sense that there seems to be that this literature about the networking, about the network of the people belonging to the board is important. And then cartel busting is a force, is a driver to change these networks. So these may have also effects on other dimensions that we don't know, like, I don't know, criminal activity in general, or other types of activities of the board. So whenever there are these sanctions, it seems that the composition changes, and then the routines and the policies of the board may change. So main takeaway is, okay, we didn't find this clear and cut effect of woman and cartel formation and breakup, but we obtained this interaction through this cartel restructuring that is really interesting. And so we may think about this cartel sanctioning and prosecution as an effective tool to promote this cartel, this board restructuring. And these board restructurings may have really interesting good effects. One of those are the gender balance, but it might be other good effects. We have a list of many further research, you can tell. So we know that we have contributed a small step in building this evidence and obtaining some non-evidence and some evidence of the effects we were expecting. The list is large. We can discuss later on in the questions and answers if you prefer. Before doing that, the recommendations for the competition agencies, this is a little bit difficult from our paper, but really we claim that competition agencies may introduce in their agenda that cartel busting has good effects, not only for the competitiveness of the market, but also on the activity of boards, so in the higher direction of firms, and with different aims. And one could be the gender balance. So it is also a policy that promotes gender balance in corporate boards when combined with this gender binding quota. So it adds a dimension, an interaction that I think is interesting. And with respect to the further research, we have a lot of questions we can discuss later on about looking for more data. This idea, let's look for other contexts in which we have more women entering into the board, maybe in the future, that's very clear. So we see the driver of changing the number and the percentage of women in boards to vary in a larger degree. Then this effect on cartel activity may appear. We don't have the distinction between listed and non-listed companies. This is important because these binding quotas might be different from one and the others. Probably looking at case studies of these cartelized firms that had restructured can tell us a lot of things about this network of who is belonging to these boards. As more countries adopt gender binding policies, we may see more of those interactions going on, and that could be interesting. And in general, so if we look for data on the gender balance on management boards and senior managers level, if we have information about who is engaging in the cartel conduct, we may not only look at the members of the board, but even at the senior or the junior management in the corporations that may be affecting really to this cartel engagement. And then the gender balance at this level, at this lower level, may have also importance. This is mostly what we wanted to present. The paper is a bit long. It has more discussions and more details, but this is in short most of what we have been able to do during this month with such an extraordinary help from the OECD. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joan-Ramon. It was it's very clear, very interesting. So basically, you're saying if we're going to have cartels, at least use this to have more women on boards.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. At least as you prosecute cartels, you will end up with more women on board. So that's nice, right? So competition authorities can claim that they are really balancing the boards.
So we don't know. Yes, Gaetano. I see my colleague Gaetano raising his hands, and I will look for other hands. Yes, Gaetano, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting to hear. When I used to work as a legal advisor, the question that we used to get from parent companies, specifically when there was a cartel that was implemented by a subsidiary, was often they asked if we fire the board of replace the board of a subsidiary, can we actually get a fine reduction, as you do when you introduce compliance programs in some countries? And our the answer was usually no. There's case law saying even if you replace people in the board, they will not have any impact on the fine. So are you actually calling for competition authorities to take this into account when setting their fines? I don't know, where maybe as aggravating, mitigating factors and so on.
That's a good idea. We didn't think about that, and it's very interesting to introduce a sanction as that. Some part of the sanction may be moderated if there is a board restructuring of one subsidiary or the parent company. It's true that it seems that the effect is there. The effect is there. So that even without the sanction, it seems that there is board restructuring, right? We found it in the case of the countries with gender quotas, binding gender quotas. It means that there is something going on, at least at the European level, is very clear. In the Spanish case, as there are not exactly binding quotas, this effect is not there. But if this is so, it means that the markets, the firms are already doing that, are already restructuring. Maybe a sanction moderation mechanism, like a compliance mechanism introducing gender balance may promote that further. That could be the case. We didn't analyze that because we don't have information about that. But it's true that if that could be an objective of a competition authority or a discussion in one country, to what extent introducing that some reduction on sanctions if there is cartel restructuring and even gender balance, then in this case we will expect to find the effect without the gender quotas, right? Without the gender quotas within the competition system, that mechanism may be effectively introduced. Yeah, sure. Thanks for the comment. Very interesting.
Well, thanks also to Gaetano. I see Thomas Ross. You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Apologies. I enjoyed that very much, and I just have a quick question for clarification, and apologies if you did speak to this. But in the countries that had the binding quotas, where you observed an increase in female participation in boards, do you know whether what was happening was that the firms were actually just starting to meet their binding quota obligations? That is, where they now, maybe because spotlight was on the firm, they're now trying to clean house and fix up other things that they're doing wrong? Or were they in fact going beyond the legislated quotas with this additional female participation?
Yeah, thanks for the comment. No, I didn't clarify that, and it's an interesting issue. For the European database of cartels, it's only 10 years. And what we have there is not many countries, but I think as you can check the paper, I think it's 3 or 4 that are introducing, that have the quotas, and even the percentage in some countries change, so keeps increasing. So I think that we checked a little bit the data, but we didn't focus more on that. But it seems that the firms were like increasing the female participation, the woman in boards, to meet these quotas. So really, it's true that. Well, I show you in this trend. I think, let me, yeah, in this, we can see this in this trend, right? So this is cartelized and non-cartelized firms. So on average, they are like increasing the quotas. And this increase is sharp for the countries that have these binding quotas. But the question, as you can see, is, okay, we start with a 10%, and then we have here like 20% on average, more or less. Okay, we have these 2 points a little bit extreme at the 7th year. This ordered is not in sequential time. Okay, it's in time of living of the cartels. Okay, so there is some movement. So this is not, I think we have in the paper the exact figure across time, exactly across time. But more or less what we found is an increase on the average percentage of women, but not very sharp. And it's quite still in the non-binding countries and sharper at the increasing in the some countries that have these binding quotas, and some of them that even change. So the firms were like filling positions, substituting men with women, but in a relaxed manner, we can say. This is one, I think, one of the problems in our database. So we don't see this sharp increase in women, right? So sometimes when you do these comparisons, whenever you have on the right-hand side, right, the variable that has a lot of variation, maybe you're not picking the effect because the variation is too small. So that's a concern. So we didn't find the effect, but we are not saying that there is no effect. We didn't find effect because the increase is so relaxed and it's heterogeneous, and it's driven mostly by the subgroup of countries that have binding quotas that we cannot identify the effect of that on any variable related to the cartel activity by itself. Yeah.
Thanks, Joan-Ramon. And I see a question from Justus. Let's take that, and then maybe we can move to the next presentation and try to group the rest of the question at the end. Justus?
I will be very short. It's just a brief comment, maybe, or idea. Given the statement on your last page where you said sometimes it's not the board that is engaging in the cartels.
Yeah.
I thought that there may be a difference in the effects depending on the firm's size. Actually, with smaller firms, I would conjecture that it's more likely that the board will know what happens inside the firm.
Yeah.
And with larger firms, they may be just too distant or too far away from the actual product managers. And so the quota, maybe the effects of the quota may be different depending on the firm's size, I would guess.
Sure. That's for sure. And in fact, I didn't say that, but that this is another difference between the European cartel base we are using, because those are 52 really larger firms. With respect to we have a larger database from Spain, and there we have a large firms, but also smaller ones. So we have variations there. And I think this is also this may think that the two databases are differences, and then in the Spanish case, it's more difficult to find this effect, right? It's true that for the bigger firms, the board has a role, and then the senior manager and the junior manager within the firm probably have different roles, and there's some literature that is looking at that, right? And then how they interact, and how there might be, like in the track cartel, some coordination at the board level, and then it's affecting all the organization down in the hierarchy. And for a firm that is smaller, probably the board is controlling much more things, and they are the executives on the board, or the CEO on the board, or the chief financial officer. There might be appearing on the board, and at the same time having these senior management positions in the firm that they are calling the shots there, and then this is the effect should be on that, right? And these executives that have much more control rather than in the board members, right? So we know that this is so, but we wanted to look at this composition and to try to measure that and see whether we find this effect there that probably is much more likely to be there in the larger firms, and in the smaller, probably looking at this detail on the organization, and the ones that really the executives are the important ones, would be much direct and to analyze this effect. Yeah, sure. Thanks for coming. Very interesting.
Thanks, Joan-Ramon. Thanks, everyone. I saw, Umut, that you had a question. I just want to leave it to the end to give the floor also to the third team. As I have announced at the beginning, I think you get a lot of the content in the title. The research project and the paper is called Cartel Behavior and Voice Club Dynamics. It's prepared by Alexis, who's a case handler at the French Autorité de la Concurrence, and by our very own Caroline Abate, esteemed colleague. So you two, the floor is yours, and looking forward.
Thank you, Despina. I will just share my screen. Okay. So we'll dive right in. I will start with the main hypotheses on which we based our study, and that were later confirmed by our analysis. So the first one relates to the difference in gender participation in cartels. And our hypothesis is that indeed it's really not about the essential nature of men and women, but about network dynamics and social structure. Indeed, there is very little evidence that women are inherently more ethical or more compliant with rules than men. And this is what we found in our extensive research. Our second hypothesis is that the preservation of shared values, loyalty, and homosocial patterns within male-dominated informal professional networks is a key factor for the maintenance of cartel practices. So what we did is that we tested our hypothesis, building a theoretical framework, which is based on behavioral economics, cartel studies, gender studies, and white-collar crime studies. So we had a multidisciplinary approach, and we completed this approach with a systematic analysis of cartel cases sanctioned by the French competition authorities, really to have a real-life illustration of these boys' club dynamics that we often mention. Just a few key points about the theoretical framework. This part is quite complex and it's very difficult to summarize it in just one slide. So I would really recommend that you all read at least this part in the paper if you can. But we have here just a few key messages from every area of research that we addressed. So from behavioral economics, the key finding was that collusion is, yes, achieved through objective discussions on prices, clients, and other competitive variables, but also by resorting to social norms such as loyalty, trust, and respect for precedent. And this is very important for the rest of our analysis. From gender studies, what we learned is that homophily, so the tendency for people to seek out, associate, or bond with people that are similar to themselves, can favor trust and predictability among same-gender individuals. And common identity bias, which really refers to the fact that people belonging to one specific group, in our case, white men, usually prefer to work and interact with other people belonging to that same group. This is particularly powerful in the context of informal male social network, professional networks, where women are usually seen as outsiders. And finally, from the literature on white-collar crime, what emerged is that men and women appear to be more alike than different in terms of moral values, but they differ with regard to motivation and opportunity when it comes to deciding to participate in illicit behavior. And opportunity here is really the key word that is at the base of our hypothesis. So white-collar crimes, according to the literature, functions primarily through all-male networks and in forums from which women are usually socially excluded. Moving on to our database, for the analysis of cartel cases, we created a database based on 50 cartels. We excluded cartels based on purely formal networks, such as professional order, unions, and so on. So cartels relying on pre-existing formal structures. And we focused on the 50 cartels based on informal or mixed networks that were sanctioned by the French Competition Authority between 2010 and March 2021. And for each cartel, we collected a number of information that you see here listed, really to disclose the details of how the cartel relationships worked and who were the participants and how these participants would behave, which is really key in our analysis. Just to give some numbers, out of the entire sample of 68 cartels, 74% of sanctioned cartels are based at least in part on informal networks that involve a core coalition of participants that presents several of the characteristics of typical boys' clubs that have been identified. And amongst the 50 cartels that are based on informal or mixed networks, 58% of such cases, they had a prior relationships among participants in the cartel. For the sake of time, I will maybe skip through this quite fast. Just a few definitions that are key in our research. So boys' club the core is really an organization recruiting men who then create a circle of solidarity both horizontally among peers and vertically through mentoring relationship. In the paper, we have more detailed description of what we mean by boys club and the evolution of this concept throughout the years. Another key definition is the definition of core coalition. So the group of people that participate in almost all collective contacts and also complement them with more direct exchanges between them in a cartel setting. And this is really key, as in many cases, the relationships between cartel participants present really striking similarities to boys club, and these similarities are seen in the core coalitions. Again, a few numbers. I think it's important. Here, this is one of our key findings. Analyzing over 50 cartels over 12 years, we see that 98.4% of participants in core coalitions were men. And this really brings together the 2 points that we've mentioned so far. So while male-dominated networks help strengthen trust and cooperation among men, they also favor the exclusion of women from certain key arenas of the economy, and also they favor their exclusion from cartels. I will now let Alexis dig a bit deeper on the role of women in cartels.
Yes, thank you, Carolina. Hi, everyone. So we haven't talked a lot about women, I think, until now. So what about women in cartels? And what we have found is that actually women play in cartels traditional social roles, meaning that the most important role played by women when they are participating in cartel is what we have called secretarial role, meaning that they are not part of the core coalition, they are not part of the main contacts, and they are not regularly contacted by other participants. But what they do is that they implement the cartels based on instruction by men who do have the prior connections with the cartel participants. And what is very important is that it happens when women have the same hierarchical level than their male counterpart, and even when they are higher ranking. And this has happened in several decisions that we have found. Can you move on, please, with the PowerPoint? The other thing is that the other type of role that we have found is the notion of maverick. But what do we mean with maverick? It doesn't mean that women exit the cartel. It means that women, when they are participants, and it's very rare, but when they are participants in cartels, they actually propose different types of practice or different way of organizing it. There are several decisions where we find that they're proposing more structured means, more outward means, more explicit, more courageous means of doing the cartels. And this combined with the secretarial roles and combined with all the data that we have found leads to very, very important conclusion is that women are members of cartels when cartels work as formal networks. And they change their behavior in the cartels when they want to bring it back to more formal networks. Formal meaning telling your boss, telling your organization, having guidelines, having a proper way of outwardly doing the practice, but doing it anyway. Only one woman in all the decisions that we found was completely involved in an informal network with a friend that she had, a close friend, part of the practice, and she built the practice with a close friend. So in the end, what we found is that there is this kind of paradox where men prefer informal networks, but these informal networks, they maintain a social hierarchy that is completely different than the structured hierarchy of the company, while usually women, when they participate in cartels, they actually try to reproduce the formal hierarchy of the company. This is because there is a link between that and the history of career of women. Because of male-dominated informal professional networks that we see in gender literature, that we see in white-collar crime literature, there is always an incentive for women to be part of formal networks, because these are the same networks that advance their career. We've seen that there was an article talking about gender quotas, binding gender quotas. Only those formal networks play along with these rules. The male-dominated informal networks, they maintain the hierarchy regardless of the regulation. And this is through the disruption of male-dominated network that you are going to see more emphasis on formal networks, and that's going to bring companies more control of whether or not entering into cartels. And this has very strong policy implications for us. First, the results show behavioral economics is a thing. It actually has to become the major explanation for cartel participation. That we need to also compare with the literature on white-collar crimes, corruption, insider trading, failure to give the accounts, etc., etc. These give us really a strong mirror of cartel policies, cartel practices. Sorry, and finally, there is a link. There is a strong affinity between the reasons that exclude women of professional informal networks and the dynamics in these professional networks that lead to cartels. This is where we have to focus our antitrust policy. And so very quick, what can competition authorities do? I will only focus on two because we don't have the time. Very simple one, use gender denomination in decisions. We need that for research. It's absolutely indispensable. And the final one that I want to focus on is advocacy policy. When you talk about cartels, sometimes there is the impression that you talk about something that is very rational, very simple, but actually it would be better to focus on the social interactions, the type of discussion, where it is, between who, what are the discussions around it. You're not only talking about cartels, you're talking about all other things. And this would better inform companies about how in their compliance programs, for example, they would be able to tackle certain situations that are conducive to cartels. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's super interesting.
We can't hear you. Yes.
Huh?
No, it's okay.
You were talking.
No, I couldn't hear you. That's why.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It's super interesting. And just so that you know, I have asked for a bit of leniency all the time. And I have bargained for an extra 5 minutes to take a couple of questions, because now it's more or less the time we should be going back to the main session. But I didn't know if anyone has questions from the floor. I don't see hands. I can try and look. Because on account of the fact that you were the last presentation, I have one question that's fairly obvious. Do you think that we heard 3 different approaches, right? How do you think that the findings work together? Because now you heard the research teams, I had all the slides, the research teams didn't have the slides of each other. Do you think that it works, the 3 projects together?
Well, we do. We actually with Carolina, we have thought about it, and we see very similar conclusions on certain elements. There is one that it's really about the trust between the actual participants in cartels. That is really the core of the thing. What about the trust that is between participants in cartels. The second one, I think it is about group dynamics. How can you really develop something that you may make you understand group dynamics beyond interest, pure rational interest in terms of price level, ability to collude or ability to deviate, etc. And also, there is really something that for me is really important, is that it's not only about the composition. That's, for example, about the boards of companies. It's not only the composition, the formal composition of a board, of a unit, of a service, of a sector. It's really about how you control the interaction. For example, there are many literature in white-collar crime showing that you may have women on board, but if the informal professional networks are still in play, and that you have a group of men close to the CEO that are still his buddies, but then you have put some women on the board. And if women are only part of the formal networks while other informal networks are still in play, then you have a problem. And I think this may explain some of the results that we have found, especially in the article about board composition. So it's really about regulating formally companies, and it's also really about understanding how informal networks are built, and then you bring trust, you bring psychology, you bring the question of betrayal adversity, as was mentioned. How do you trust people within these informal professional networks, and how you can also tackle them so you understand how they work and how you can stop their effects.
Yeah, super interesting. I think it goes with a lot with the Düsseldorf paper that says, I saw that in the paper that says, yeah, we may have instances of betrayal aversion, but that depends on the distance in the social networks. So it's good to monitor business connection, which is absolutely aligned. Exactly. What we need to do, I am sorry, and I saw very quickly, I don't know, Juan-Ramon, if you have 1 minute to answer to Umut in the chat. Did you see the question?
Yeah, I see this. I saw the question. I was going to ask you just for a 1 minute 30-second reply. So thanks for the question. And we have not looked at this evidence that I think you are asking for. I think this can be very interesting to see really this restructuring. So this is something that literature had identified, that there is restructuring after a cartel is sanctioned in the board. So that's interesting. The new evidence we are raising here is that in these countries that have binding quotas, this restructuring is balancing the gender of the board. But we don't know yet why the firms do that, and whether they use it just to I don't know, as an image, as a promotion, or selling that as a corporate responsibility duty or whatever. It's true that they are, well, there are binding quotas there, so they cannot claim that they do it voluntarily, so they cannot do that. But they are at least doing that. And it's true that then for our first result, again, we are not saying that there is not an impact, but we didn't find it. Okay, so that it's true that if the firms are telling that they introduce gender balance to avoid cartel conduct, we haven't seen that. So this argument is not used by the firms, and probably. This is something that needs a clear identification of the effect of the gender balance and the reduction in the cartel activity, and then maybe the firms will use that argument. But we haven't seen that yet. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you, Joan-Ramon. And I'm really sorry we don't have more time for this, because I'm sure there are more questions. Just if I may, we'll see if we can take this conversation can continue via LinkedIn, can continue through other channels. We at the OECD can work as a hub, so send us questions. We can see if we can put you in touch with each other. So just do that. Right now, we have to go back to the main room. As a moderator, my duty is to wrap up. I think it's been, just to say, unless I hear any objections, it's been fairly conclusive that maybe gender can create, for different reasons, it can be a risk factor for cartels. And we'll see how we move from this, because you heard we're going to use what we discussed in this session and in the other two sessions, I don't know what they said, as the first step towards a toolkit for including gender consideration in competition law enforcement and advocacy. So may I invite everyone to go back to the main room. I hope I know how to do it. I think you have a little button at the end that says at the bottom of the page that says leave room, and I think you're supposed to do that. So we'll see each other in like some seconds.